Good morning. This is the February MTA Board meeting, and I'd like to know, are there any public speakers, Mr. Morello?
Yes, there are, Mr. Chairman. There are three. Our electronic timekeeping system is not working, so we'll work from a Timex. As the speakers approach the 2-minute limit, we'll advise them verbally that they should wrap up their comments. So we have three speakers, the first of whom is Richard Ravitch.
Welcome, Dick, and as many of you know, he's the fourth chairman of the MTA and a longtime supporter of the MTA and its services.
Mr. Chairman, members of the board, I realized it was 30 years ago that I chaired this wonderful institution, and I like to think that as a citizen I've been helpful and supportive during that period of time. I've always been reluctant to offer advice to the board because I'm not sure I received advice from outsiders very graciously when I was chairman. But a recent news story about lowering the tolls on the Verrazano Bridge struck me as something I feel sufficiently strongly about that I want to offer some advice which you may or may not accept. As you know, in 2010, during my brief tenure as Lieutenant Governor, there was a bill that attempted to define the fiduciary responsibilities of members of the Board of Public Authorities more precisely. And I don't see Governor Patterson here today, who I believe is a member of your board, but he signed that bill into law. And that law made it very clear that you, as members of the Board of a Public Authority, have as your fiduciary responsibility an obligation to the mission of this authority and to the authority itself. And that is your overriding obligation. And you are arguably liable for a failure to meet that fiduciary obligation. And I might point out, to the best of my knowledge, there is no indemnification from the authority itself. Now, let me tell you why I think lowering the tolls on the Verrazano Bridge is a breach of that obligation. The obligation to the authority and its purposes. You are in the midst of two labor negotiations in which you are undoubtedly asserting and properly so the financial constraints that make it impossible for you to meet the demands of the labor unions. That argument is inconsistent with voluntarily reducing the revenues of this authority. Second, as I understand it, and I follow this carefully, having authored the idea of a 5-year capital plan, having started the process which has been honored by every MTA board since then, to place a great deal of emphasis on restoring the system to a state of good repair, lowering these tolls will result in reduced revenue and consequently a reduced capacity to incur debt for capital purposes in your next 5-year plan, for which, as I understand from the press, you do not yet have the resources available to come close to meeting what your demands of this authority and the demands of the public transportation system in this region are going to require. So, I'll conclude by simply saying, obviously, I feel strongly enough about this, remembering all the battles that I fought to eke out every possible penny of revenue for this authority, to urge you to think very hard before you vote to voluntarily reduce the revenues to the MTA, for not just the reasons of your fiduciary responsibility, but because of plain, simple common sense. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Roach.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Murray Bowden.
I apologize to two people who I may have been inappropriate to in recent days. I followed Richard Ravitch quite closely over the years and had the opportunity once to be standing in nearby where he was a speaker. And he took charge of the situation and did what most people are afraid to do. He stepped in when a long-winded speaker couldn't stop speaking. He did the right thing. And he has my highest respect. I was at the New Jersey Turnpike Board meeting yesterday, and after the meeting I was standing when Jim Simpson was interviewed by the press, and he talked about the salt shipment. It's in the New Jersey paper today. They found, like everybody else, they're short salt, and they found some 400 tons or whatever the number is on the dock in Searsport, Maine, standing next to a ship that had just unloaded a cargo and was available because the ship was coming empty to Newark. And this came to mind last night because on a paper and radio it said that a barge came with 95 tons. That was New Jersey Turnpike salt, misconstrued on a newspaper and a news broadcast. So there's a problem. In 1920, they wrote a law saying that you couldn't use a ship that was not American flag to go from one American port to the other. The ship that was there happened to be a flag outside the United States, so maybe you don't remember, Jim Simpson was on this board, went from here to Federal Transportation Administration. He was the administrator. He's now Commissioner of State Transportation for the state of New Jersey, headed of New Jersey Transit, and head of the Jersey Turnpike. So he asked for a waiver of a 1920 law, and he was turned down because the bureaucracy doesn't know how to respond. It's relevant because within this organization there are people not at the top but at a senior staff level who respond similarly. We've always done it that way. The red fire engine syndrome, the train horn syndrome, the lights on the railroad crossings. How do you begin to think?
Could you wrap up, please, Mr. Bowden?
I came in this morning on a very packed train on Metro North. If you took some of the older cars, took the controls out and made triples out of doubles, and opened them up so you could walk through all three cars, the train would not be as crowded, there would be more seats. But that's thinking outside the box. You don't need new cars. You can use the ones you already have and convert them to walkthroughs where a passenger could see through. And then you could run 9-car trains, 10-car trains at an 8-car platform. How do you begin to change the fixed minds of people? It's a very difficult thing. I apologize if I've run a little over time.
Thank you very much. Final speaker is Joseph Catrufo.
Thank you. My name is Joseph Catrufo, and I'm the Communications Associate with the Tri-State Transportation Campaign, a nonprofit organization working toward a more balanced, transit-friendly, and equitable transportation system in New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. And like Mr. Ravitch, I'm here to discuss the lowering of the tolls on the Verrazano Narrows Bridge. We urge the MTA Board to reject the proposal to reduce tolls on the Verrazano Narrows Bridge for the following reasons. 1, it addresses the wrong inequity for Staten Island residents. The inequity that must be addressed is Staten Island's lack of robust transit. The borough's 471,000 residents need transportation options like faster, more modern, more convenient bus service that serves more of Staten Island's neighborhoods. Without these options, residents have no choice but to drive. 2, in general, toll reductions are bad policy. They incentivize driving and contribute to traffic congestion. More cars on the roads also threaten pedestrian safety. According to Tri-State Transportation Campaign's annual analysis, most dangerous roads for walking in the region, nearly half of Staten Island's 21 pedestrian fatalities between 2010 and 2012 occurred in close proximity to Interstate 278. More cars on the road only increase this risk. 3. This is an unsustainable toll reduction proposal offered for 1 year and at an expense to MTA and New York State taxpayers, each who are contributing $7 million. This loss to the MTA is compounded by the $40 million diversion of dedicated transit revenue proposed by Governor Cuomo in his executive budget. Many opportunities to improve service are lost with this overall total decrease of $47 million in the MTA's budget. Again, toll relief is not a strategy that addresses Staten Island's long-term transportation needs. An investment in faster, more frequent, convenient bus service is a better use of MTA and state funds. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That concludes public comment.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the February board. I'd like to begin the meeting today by offering a moment of silence for a loss of one of our employees, bus operator William Pena, who was killed in a tragic accident while performing his duties in providing bus service for New York when a stolen truck slammed into his bus. Thank you. Next, after Monday's safety-focused committee meetings, all of you saw at least one of the safety presentations. If you attended one, more if you attended more, of each one of the agency's safety initiatives and how they're organized and how they approach safety. I would like to start today's meeting to talk about spend a little time talking about our renewed commitment to safety across all the agencies. As I think most of you know, I've worked at the MTA for over 20 years. A good number of those years have been in safety functions, but safety. This background informs me and guides me in the role I have here as chairman. Safety is everybody's job. It's their number one priority, and it's essential that we keep that as our focus. It has to be our top priority always. And it means safety will shape every decision I and the senior leaders of all of our organizations make. Because nothing is more important to me than the safety and the security of the system, our customers, our passengers, and the public we interact with. Toward that end, I want to give you a brief overview of the top level safety-related actions we've taken over the past month. We've created a position of Corporate Chief Safety Officer, a new senior management position at the MTA reporting directly to me, who will assist and provide support and oversight of the safety functions at the agencies. Each MTA agency will ensure that its top safety officer is a direct report to the chief executive. In many of the agencies that already existed, but at those that did not, that change is being made. We've created a new safety committee on the board so that we can make sure that there is a board level focus on safety initiatives that are either held at the MTA level, at the agencies, or across agencies. And at Metro North, we're separating out the safety function from the security function to make sure that the safety eyes and ears of that agency in support of all its other employees have an undiluted focus on safety. These actions will reinforce in the minds of our customers, the board, and our employees that safe operations are the foundation of each agency. Next, I would like to take the opportunity to introduce the new president of Metro North, Mr. Joe Giletti. He's an essential find for us. He's somebody that comes with an extensive background, over 41 years in railroading. Started out at the Penn Central, Conrail, and spent the first 15 years in the MTA family at Metro North. He went to go down to Tri-Rail in Florida, and he's coming back to us leading the position of executive director. So he's got the benefit of an executive director experience along with the underpinning of a knowledge of the operation of the largest or second largest, because there's always competition between Long Island and Metro North as to who's the largest commuter railroad agency in the country. And I think you'll be able to hit the ground running and provide excellent leadership for us as we try to bring that railroad back to where it was as the leader in the industry. Joe?
Again, I'm indebted, and I was asked even this morning, how do you say it was an honor? It is an honor. It's an honor to be back at the MTA. I started in '71. I actually collected tickets. I was trained as a locomotive engineer. I eventually trained the locomotive engineers co-wrote the rule book and trained the dispatchers. So I do feel that it's an organization that I know and that I've actually walked the 3 lines that are there. And it's tremendous to have a chair that I've known for over 30 years. I missed an opportunity to work with him over 20 years ago, and I welcome the opportunity to work with him again now, and I welcome the opportunity to get to know you as a board. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. I'd also pleased to announce the appointment of Jerry Page as MTA's General Counsel. We now have 2 Mr. Pages on at this meeting. Jerry is a longtime MTA employee. He was previously MTA's first Deputy General Counsel and most recently served as MTA's Director of Strategic Initiatives. Please join me in welcoming Jerry to his new position. The minutes of the January's meeting have been distributed to all. Are there any corrections or omissions? If not, may I have a motion to approve the minutes? Seconded? Second. Any discussion? All in favor? Aye. Sir, approved. Committee on Finance, report from Chair of that committee, Mr. Andrew Saul.
Okay, Tom, thank you. There are 2 action items on the agenda for board approval. The first action item to be considered and recommended is the transfer of the 2013 TBTA operating surplus as described in the staff summary and resolution distributed at the Bridges and Tunnels and the Finance Committee meetings. The second item is the authorization of the MRT-2 escalator payments to Dutchess, Orange, and Rockland counties. The committee recommends these action items, and I move them.
Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye. Okay. The final action item to be considered and recommended are the 2 Verrazzano Narrows Bridge toll rebate programs as described in the staff summary and resolution distributed at the Bridges and Tunnels and the Finance Committee meetings. The committee recommends this action item, and I move it.
Any motion? Any discussion? Mr. Capelli?
Certainly, Mr. Chairman. I'm very pleased to see that this item is finally on the agenda. It's been discussed internally since the summer of 2012 amongst the local elected officials, then Chairman Joe Loda, members of the Executive Chamber, the Governor, the Speaker of the Assembly, the Senate Majority Leader Dean Skelos, and so on. There have been a number of permutations of it. It has been very carefully looked at for revenue implications, for policy implications, and it enjoys the support of the leadership of the government of the state of New York, who is our primary funding mechanism. This doesn't solve all of the problems of the people of Staten Island, and I agree with some of the comments made by 2 of the speakers here today, specifically the tri-state planning, of whom I normally am in agreement with, that the real need for Staten Island is investments in the infrastructure to improve public transportation. But even though there are some in the works, they will be years before they come to fruition. In my opinion, there needs to even be more, which involve the expenditure of huge amounts of capital money, which I don't see anywhere on the horizon. And the people of Staten Island are in a position of essentially agreeing that they need more transportation, but not knowing when it's going to come, and having to rely upon their cars for the burden. So as an interim measure toward bringing about relief to people who are captive and unable to leave without paying tolls, the state is forwarded for our consideration, and we are forwarding for this board's consideration this initiative. In addition, there has been a discussion of the impact on of our tolls, which we know have reached a point of severe impact in many communities, and particularly the business community for some time. And the commercial aspect of this plan is not a Staten Island only proposal. This is for any business operating in the region, certainly within our region, or anybody who is a part of our system gets to take the advantage of it. The governor's office and the speaker and the majority leader agree that this is an important relief for people whose businesses have been onerously affected. I think that this is something that is historic and that we should be celebrating that we're able to bring about. And I urge my colleagues to support it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Capelli. Mr. Pelli?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I speak in two capacities. Number one, I do want to express my support for the motion. I fully understand the implications on the Staten Island residents and fully support that aspect of it. However, as I indicated at the Finance Committee on Monday, I believe that this action should be part of a larger action at the same time encompassing relief and support for enhancements on the Long Island Railroad, on Metro North, and on the subway and bus system. And I indicated on the Monday an amendment to add $3 million to the $7 million we're already allocating, because my assumption is if we can find 7, we can find 10 to provide additional relief for our other residents and commuters who live in other parts of the region. Unfortunately, the Finance Committee turned that amendment down. I am not planning on making it again because of this one thing I can do after 40 years is count. But be that as it may, I still believe that it is essential that this action be part of a larger action. And if we had waited until July, when the chairman indicated at the December meeting, in our conversation in December, that we were going to do everything together, we would not be having this discussion at the moment, because we would all be having the discussion together. Unfortunately, that is not taking place, and I believe that's unfortunate. But notwithstanding that, as Pip said last night on Turner Classic Movies, I await our discussion in July with great expectations. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Pelli.
I appreciate all the effort that went into getting this program in place. We all supported Mr. Capelli, but I too thought it would happen in July after a wider look. I'm going to talk about inequities. The inequities in the system abound. I represent west of Hudson, the most significantly underserved part of the MTA. We're underserved, overpriced compared to competing transit opportunities, and severely overtaxed. The only way MTA should look at any initiative like this is by enterprise-wide approaches. When we give to one component, we are belittling the others. We truly are captives. Our counties are captives of the MTA. I oppose piecemealing anything, even though I would love to see some of these inequities evened out a bit. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Susan.
I have a question and then I have a comment. One of the speakers today mentioned that this rebate was for a year. It is not for a year only, it's ongoing. Am I correct in that?
No, I believe it's for a year. When the money runs out, the rebate program ends. Jimmy, do you want to provide?
Andrew, it's specified in the staff summary. There's a sunset for the monies that are appropriated for this staff summary. So it's explained in the staff summary.
So at that time, the toll would rebound to where it was? Or there would be a push to find money again for it?
It's a rebate program. It's not a toll reduction program. It's a rebate
Okay.
program. That's a specific, and we like the Rockaways. The Rockaways has a rebate program. So the toll remains the same, and the people who qualify it are given a rebate through the Easy Pass system. Is that correct, Jimmy?
Exactly. The customers that are part of the New York City Service Center Easy Pass system would reap the benefit of the rebate on the commercial side, and on the residential side, they must be residents of Staten Island.
Right. Well, what I wanted to say then is this discussion really is about fairness, as Commissioner Metzger points out. Nobody's against, and I agree that the tolls to Staten Island are too high. That's why we need to have a discussion at some point soon, I hope, about something of, and it doesn't have to be exactly the Sam Schwartz Move New York plan, but a place where the tolls are realigned, which will be good for drivers, which will be good for transit and commuter rail users, where we start to make sense of tolls that serve the central business district and those that don't. As Sam Schwartz frequently said, you would think Staten Island was the center of the New York universe by the amount of the tolls those folks have to pay. You would think it was mid-Manhattan. So, at some point I hope we're going to have that kind of discussion. Many plans are out there, and, it's fine that we do this now, but I think the discussion needs to be had, as Susan has said.
Jerry, do you want to qualify that?
Yeah, just on the issue of the 1 year versus multi-year, the program is a multi-year program, and each year's rollover depends upon the legislature having identified money for their half of the rebate. So it is intended that when this is adopted, it's an ongoing program that's looked at on a year-by-year basis.
That's different.
Mitch, would you speak into the board?
You cannot assume the legislature is going to appropriate the funds year to year. So technically, the program expires March 31st, 2015, unless the legislature appropriates funds again in next year's budget. And that would be ongoing year to year. So that you cannot prejudge what the legislature is going to do. That's why technically it's a 1 year program with a review.
I guess the question
Based
would
upon
be,
my years in the legislature.
does that reappropriation, if you will, fall upon the MTA as well?
My understanding, yes, that this is an action that would be ongoing, and the MTA half of the funds would continue without further board action if the legislature moves forward.
That sounds, that's a black letter, I assume, because, if this board is now appropriating money for that, just as the legislature is appropriating money, and to say that, so it really is apples and oranges between us and the legislature, is what you're saying.
I'm not sure what you mean, apples and oranges.
We are appropriating money this year, they are appropriating money this year. But next year, if they don't appropriate the money, it goes away. But if we don't appropriate the money, or we're not called upon to appropriate the money in the same way next year.
That's correct. The MTA Board is taking a multi-year action, and dependent upon the legislature's annual appropriation, which happens, in lots of contexts.
There's a question over here. Carl?
Yes. I understand everybody's concern. All the board members have different issues that they're coming forward. But if anybody moves on anything where we're going to be cutting and trying to help out as far as Staten Island is concerned, I think when the papers get a hold of that, it's going to make us look horrible. And I agree with everything that Susan Metzger said, because we're both in the same position. And I don't want to repeat it and keep this thing going. But any action that anybody on this board makes when we're in the situation that we're in and the negotiations that are going on with labor unions and other issues, I don't think we should do anything at this point, but also keep in mind his concerns, and let's look at it in the future.
Jeff?
I think it's clear that this isn't just a small issue of addressing Staten Island and its residents. And clearly there's inequity issues about services on Staten Island and elsewhere throughout the system. There's inequities about various bridge tolls in and around the city and the region. There's inequities on a whole number of levels. And so this sets a precedent of a very difficult issue. So I guess if you look at it from a positive side, I hope this is not a missed opportunity and that this begins to address those inequities. been around government long enough to realize change happens incrementally. And every once in a while, someone comes up with some big ideas. I know Dick Ravitch, who spoke earlier, had many big ideas, and sometimes throughout history we've taken them and many times we haven't. And so I don't necessarily want to look a gift horse in the mouth. And I say it's a gift horse because I guess the leaders of the state, in their wisdom, have suggested this and are funding this. Now, does that put us in a bad position? I understand that. Does that put us in a bad position? I don't know. But I guess I will take some solace in that if the leaders of the state are taking these, or are making these suggestions, for lack of a better term, or funding decisions to incrementally change the system in the MTA, I really do hope that they recognize they're taking ownership over our funding decisions. And so when we come to them in the next 3 months, guys, we're doing what you asked us to do. I know, look, I've been here before. It doesn't seem like too long ago where they laid out a whole plan where they're going to do things and things changed. But we need to keep reminding them if they want to continue to be a funding partner, and we work with them and they work with us, and we implement some of their suggestions, that they take some ownership over this. And I think, frankly, I think the governor has taken some ownership over the MTA and has been very involved in moving in a positive direction. I know the leaders of the state are taking that, and let's just continue to remind them as we move forward. So, we should take this. It's one small change in the inequity. I can list enormous amount of others, as everyone else can. But let's at least take solace that they're taking some sort of ownership over this. And hopefully we can remind them of that when we do need to have a very, very important capital plan coming up.
Mr. Brown?
Yeah, I don't know how you can make decisions on MTA issues if you're waiting for all inequities and disequilibriums in the system to disappear. What we really do is this is a huge region that with varying levels of productivity and access to the city, and the MTA modulates those aspects of the transportation economy, and we compete with private cars as a mode in the whole environment. Now, I don't see how, in effect, when you run bus service from Staten Island, or when you run the free ferry from Staten Island, you are providing people a way off the island. And I fail to see why lowering the tolls is the only method you have for addressing the inequities. And why are lower bus fares not an equal, do they not have an equal claim on the MTA's resources as the lower toll revenues? Now, as far as inequities go, I live in a little place called Brooklyn, and we cross that same bridge. And we're the ones that pay the toll you're always citing as the horrible toll. The $6 is already a substantial, do the math. Was it 40% of the toll? And to further lower that and not address the other mass transit inequities that Staten Island has, some self-inflicted by their land use decisions over there. They want to have a suburban area, yet you want efficient service. In effect, you're demanding more road building by lowering the tolls. Bus service from Staten Island saves you road space, saves Brooklyn road space, saves New York City road space. That's very expensive road space. And I just don't see how fares and service are not have an equal claim on the revenues.
Jim? Excuse me, let me go to Jonathan, because he didn't get a chance to comment yet, and I'll come back to you.
Thank you, Tom. I don't want to repeat my comments from the Finance Committee the other day, but I do want to comment just a little further on the board fiduciary obligations. We have carefully reviewed the facts and been briefed and considered the impact that this resolution would have on the entire MTA system. And it's my understanding, and I ask General Counsel to correct me if I'm wrong, that we have wide latitude to make policy decisions, including those related to tolls and service. And I also want to point out that we've been informed that Council is comfortable that the resolution doesn't violate the bond covenants to which we are obligated, and that's a very important consideration
prior to a vote, particularly in the context of our fiduciary duties and obligations.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Andrew?
I support this for the following reasons. Number one, nobody here probably is more concerned about the finances of the MTA and to go ahead and obligate us to additional expenses without really knowing where our budget is. But this, Jeff said, is the first time, not the first time, but a definitive time where the legislature has actually appropriated money to pay for this particular rebate. Plus the fact there actually was additional aid from the state above our budget applicable for this use for this year. The one question I do have is we have to be very careful that when we consider other things going forward in July and next year, that we make sure that we hold the legislature and the state, if they want this rebate to continue, that they have to pay for it next year, and that it doesn't just become an additional 14 million or whatever it is in our budget. So I think that's something we really should look at, because if there's going to be a partnership for additional things like this with the state, and I think it's a very good idea, and they can find the money, there's no reason why we shouldn't do it, but we have to make sure that in fact going forward, if it's extended for another year, that the money is appropriated by the legislature.
Mark Page?
I believe that the essence of what's happening here is that the state of New York has determined that the state wants to spend its money for the purpose of reducing the toll of Staten Island residents on the Verrazano Bridge. Obviously, the state has very broad powers in terms of how it spends its money. I would observe that I don't believe they have in fact appropriated the money at this point. I think it's a proposal as opposed to an appropriation, but that's a minor technicality at the moment. I don't believe that if the question were being asked solely of the MTA and this board, that we would be taking this action ourselves with our resources at this moment. I think that, as has been observed earlier, there are a number of purposes that we're obviously concerned about. I think, as I mentioned on Monday, that our basic agenda is mass transit. It is trying to more efficiently use facilities we have, including roads and buses, carry more people and occupy less space than private cars. We do have a free ferry that runs from Staten Island into the city. We have a one fare policy in terms of what it actually costs a Staten Island resident, and I realize it's time and inconvenience as well as money, so there are all kinds of issues here. But at the end of the day, I think that this is a state initiative, not an MTA initiative. Okay, as a board member, I intend to abstain from this vote because I don't believe that in fact this is our initiative, and I don't think that all of the sort of judgmental considerations that we would normally engage to balance out and consider an investment of this kind are in fact being applied here.
Ira?
Yes, I'm concerned, as many other board members, with a couple of issues. One, the actual impact on the MTA is 7 million. I think we have to be very mindful of that, and that's ongoing year after year. I think that's something we have to think about, and also equity with everybody else. You do something for one, everybody else starts to say, "How about me?" And I have these problems or whatever they have, or whatever issue they have, transportation issue that we should be addressing. I suppose going forward we should look at increases in service, and I would certainly associate myself with Mitch Palley's comments, and I think that's what we probably should have been doing, is at least find 3 million or even 5 million for additional service if we're going to do this, because we did find 7 million for this. So if I could have a vote, Mitch, you could count me. Thank you.
Any further comment? I'd just like to sum up as chair. I think both public speakers and a number of the board members talked about the importance of fiduciary responsibility. For those of you that have gone through the confirmation process, you know what that's like in terms of the background review. You go up to Albany, you get interviewed by members of the Transportation Committee, and immediately after the vote in the Senate chamber, you're handed a document that you're supposed to sign, which spells out in excruciating detail what your fiduciary responsibility is. So I think in all the comments that were made here today by the speakers and by the board members, it's the exercising of that fiduciary responsibility that we're doing. The other thing, there's another point here, is that I will stand committed to the comment that I made at the December board meeting, which is we will bring forward, as the pattern that has developed for the past 2 years at least, at the mid-year forecast in July, whatever resources we have, and look to see if there's opportunities to either add service back that was cut back in 2010 or implementation of new service. I think that's a pattern that's good to follow, because we're following the lead of available resources and matching that those available resources with identified needs in terms of service, and I stand committed to continuing to do that. The fact that this is something that did emanate 2 years ago in the legislature, and they've been working toward it, provides some significance in terms of its importance to them. They are a stakeholder of ours. We are dependent on them, and I think many people here mentioned the fact that we need to take that into consideration. The other point is, and we've talked about this when we deal with the fares and tolls, long-standing tradition, one of the few agencies in the country that has the ability to actually charge more money for tolls and use those revenues to subsidize public transit operations. But there's a sensitivity to that, because we know the elasticity of toll increases is far greater than the elasticity of fare increases. That means for every dollar you charge, you chase people away. So you got to be sensitive. We have to be sensitive to that. So I'm supportive of this measure. I'm going to vote it up. But I do think the dialogue we had here today needs to be carried forward in all the different forms with all the different stakeholders in terms of this shared relationship we have, somewhat symbiotic, that to make sure that our needs and our responsibilities as board members for the MTA are met. Pending no further discussion, do I have a motion?
So moved.
Seconded? All those in favor? Aye.
Okay.
Abstention.
Tom, there are 4 procurement actions this month in the total amount of $8.4 million. There are no non-competitive procurements. There are 4 competitive procurements in the total amount of $8.4 million. The committee recommends these procurements, and I move them.
Second.
Any further discussion, comments? All those in favor?
Aye. There are no ratifications. There are 4 real estate action items which are described on pages 48-59 in the board book distributed for this meeting. The committee recommends these real estate items, and I move them.
Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye. Tom, this concludes the finance report.
Mr. Farrar, the chairman of the Transit Committee, will give its report.
Mr. Chairman, the Transit and Bus Committee met on Monday and reports the following. There is 1 action item this month. The action item approves the access and work agreement with the 301 69th Street Owners Corporation. The committee recommends this action item, and I move it.
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye. There are 4 procurement actions totaling $11 million. There is 1 non-competitive procurement for MTA New York City Transit in the amount of $5.3 million. The committee recommends this procurement, and I move it.
Second.
Any discussion, comments? All those in favor?
Aye. There are 3 competitive procurements for 2 for MTA New York City Transit and 1 for capital construction in the total amount of $5.7 million. The committee recommends these procurements, and I move them.
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor? Aye.
Aye. There are no ratifications, and Mr. Chairman, this concludes the transit and bus report.
Thank you, Mr. Farrar. There are two reports from Mr. Pally today, who is not only representing the Long Island Committee, but in Mr. Sedor's absence, the Metro North Committee, and he'll provide that report first. Mr. Pally?
The Metro North Railroad Committee met and makes the following requests. There are 4 procurement actions in the total amount of $966,000. There is 1 non-competitive procurement totaling $376,000. The committee recommends this procurement, and I move it.
Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye. There are no competitive procurements. There are 3 ratifications in the total amount of $590,000. The committee recommends these ratifications, and I move them.
Seconded. Any discussion? All those in favor?
That concludes the Metro North report. I'll move on to the Long Island Railroad Committee report. There are 2 procurement actions in the total amount of $2.1 million. There are no non-competitive procurements. There are 2 competitive procurements for MTA Capital Construction in the total amount of $2.1 million. The committee recommends these procurements, and I move them.
Any discussion? All those in favor?
There are no ratifications, and this concludes the report of the Long Island Railroad Committee, sir.
Mr. Alan Capelli will provide the report from Bridges and Tunnels.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Bridges and Tunnels Committee met this month and report the following. There are 2 procurements in the total amount of $12.913 million. There are no non-competitive procurements. There are 2 competitive procurements in the total amount of $12.913 million. The committee recommends these procurements, and I move them.
Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
There are no ratifications. This concludes Bridges and Tunnels Committee report. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I might say, I would just like to thank the board for going on record as supporting the proposal, and I now will return to my normal role working with Mitch Paley to fight for the service inequities around the region. So thank you all.
I chaired this month's meeting of the Corporate Governance Committee. There are 2 action items this month. The first action item approves the revisions to the MTA Code of Ethics as updated on pages 99 through 110 of the board book. And the second action item approves the revisions to the Corporate Governance and Finance Committee charters set forth on pages 111 through 117 of the board book. The committee recommends these action items, and I move them. Any discussion? All those in favor? That concludes the Governance Committee's report. I would now like to go into executive session pursuant to Section 105(1)(e) of the New York State Public Officers Law for matters relating to collective negotiations. May I have a motion? All those in favor?
Was that an MTA idea? Was the governor involved in that?
I'm sorry, which idea?
Decision? In reducing the increase, the anticipated increase coming?
There was a dialogue. There were a couple editorials in one of the dailies, but there had been an ongoing dialogue with respect to how are we trying to balance the pain of trying to live within a financial envelope, generate savings, generate money to be able to provide services. So it was part of that dialogue.
Tom, can you talk about the Long Island Railroad situation? Seems to be heading in a pretty bad place. I think it was last week, a union official said that the MTA's decision not to adhere to the PEB ruling was essentially spitting in the face of the board, if not the workers. Can you comment where it's heading, and you have any thoughts on, the dialogue back and forth?
This is the place I normally say that we don't negotiate in public, but I'm going to make an exception. I'm not going to negotiate in public, but I think it's apropos for me to bring up to speed people, the news media, in terms of where we're at and what the thought process is, because there's been a lot of dialogue out there. And I want to do it in a way that's not filled with vitriol and emotion, because I think it's important, if not essential, that the parties who are involved in those discussions and negotiations keep that front of mind, because it is a very, very important situation. First of all, there have been statements out there that we're trying to provoke a strike. That couldn't be more further from the truth. When I was confirmed chairman on June 20th of last year, one of my highest priorities was to get involved with the collective bargaining negotiations to an even greater extent than I was. And there were a series of negotiation sessions in September where we came to the table and we were actively trying to find out solutions where the parties could agree to find money to pay raises and that we could live within our financial means. And it became clearly evident to me at that time that the union or the coalition in unions was not in a place to be able to do that. For whatever reason, it was just unsuccessful. Government was shut down. One of the first things that happened when the government came back to service, in service, is the National Mediation Board basically informed all the parties that we were released. What is released means? It means you take it to this next stage, which is a very sensitive stage. I mean, we've been on record in the past about railway labor. It's an act that was created at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. It was at a point in time when the robber barons were placing very undue pressure on employees and workers, and it was a necessary piece of legislation to protect people back then. I'm not so sure how applicable it is today for public sector commuter rail agencies, but it's the law of the land. So that process basically, and you've heard us say it before, starts a 270-day clock through a series of presidential emergency boards, presentations almost in a litigation type way. Each party presents their case and recommendations coming out. If you go through both presidential emergency boards, all the cooling off periods, at the end of 270 days, the term used is the right of self-help. Either party can reach a point. Once you're in that, that clock goes. And there's really no stopping that clock unless there be congressional action, which is very rare, if ever, to occur. At that point in time, I think parties really need to think through very carefully what they're doing, what they're saying, how they're acting, and how they're responding, because it's a very sensitive situation. I don't think labor, management, the public, elected officials want to get to an end game where there's a work stoppage or there's service not being provided. That's not in anyone's interest. But we find ourselves in a position where that's where we're at. So I'm a little surprised when people say that if we don't accept these particular terms and the recommendations that we're provoking a strike. We came to the table in September willing to negotiate, and we didn't get there, but we are where we are. The next thing I want to say is, because a number of people said we were relatively quick in terms of how we said we couldn't accept the PEB recommendations, but then they said, well, why aren't you asking for a second presidential emergency board? It's pretty simple. The PEB recommendations said that we could afford a fare increase of about 2.83% per year for each of 6 years. The one-time hit wage increases, the one-time hit in terms of $750 million up front, if you take that as a pattern that would extend across all the other collective bargaining agreements we have within the MTA family, is about $750 million in a one-time hit and $400 million in outgoing annual expenses. We cannot afford that. They also said that we could go and look at increasing fares. These were the recommendations of the PEB, taking some of the pay-as-you-go capital money or reducing money set aside for retiree benefits. It was the expert witness testimony of labor who basically said, and these were his, I'll use his quote. He refers to 126, which I think is a document exhibit that he presented. 126 gives you the average fares historically, and it shows how they have been falling in real terms. My point being that the passenger has had a good run here at the MTA, and it is about time the fares went up. That's an expert witness that the union brought forward. The board of the MTA says they don't agree with that. It's a little unusual to me when we had, as part of the grand bargain in 2010, a 10% increase in 2009. In 2009, a 7.5% fare increase, 7.5% fare increase in 2011, and another 7.5% increase in 2013. How that statement can be made, but it certainly was made, and even the PEB recommendation said you can raise fares. We're not there. With respect to the issue of pay-as-you-go capital, our capital programs are relatively large, $25, $27 billion. And we can't go to Albany and ask for all that money to be provided by them or the federal government. So we generate money, what we call pay-as-you-go capital, that we use to provide as a basis and get us to somewhere near a third to a half of that money. In terms of pay-as-you-go capital, the money we have prospectively looked at, that they're asking us to take a look at and fund raises with. First of all, we shouldn't be spending capital dollars for operating expenses. That's a lesson New York learned under Abe Beam. We shouldn't do that. That's number one. But if we were, that's about almost $3 billion in direct dollar for dollar. But if you use that to fund, bond finance, it generates almost $7 billion, $6.96 billion in money. So we don't want to go there. So we're sitting in a position where we could easily say we can't accept the recommendations, and we're trying to exhaustively look through options where we could go back to the union and find ways to be able to fund this. And we haven't been able to come up with one. As we've been asked to come down to be part of another session with the National Mediation Board tomorrow and Friday with labor, and we'll have another attempt at it. Failing to reach an agreement there, we've been on record as saying we will ask for a second presidential emergency board, and that's what we're going to do. I just want to make sure I covered everything. I mean, the other item that we have up there, and it's not a cost item, but we think it's an important item, and you've seen the play on it. We made a proposal to have incentives to make sure people don't abuse the disability pension for railroad retirement, because that's been an issue out there, and that's a cause for concern. You generally, when you want to insert provisions in a collective bargaining agreement, you do at the time of negotiations. We think that's an important point. That was also in there. Next question.
Tom, could you put everything you just said in the context of the MTA and labor more generally? You've got a lot of union conversations to have in the coming months, and I'm wondering if you think that, given what cuts the MTA has done over the past couple of years to the expenses you can directly control, the political lobbying you've had to do for the PMT and for capital plans, whether you are reaching a point where the relationship between the MTA and its labor unions is going to have to significantly change. It sounds like you two are talking past each other. They're saying the MTA can find the money, they always find the money. And you're saying we can't find the money beyond things that we have just decided are too onerous or are frankly dangerous if you're talking about skipping on some capital investment. So do you think that we're at a point, an inflection point, where the MTA is really going to have to change its relationship with labor, shrink it, significantly change retirement, significantly change rates of pay? And are you going to have to fight with them to really get some of that stuff done?
To deal with the financial problems we've had since 2010, we've identified the size of the ask we need to be able to reduce the budget and reduce costs. So we had some fare increases, we had some service reductions. Both of those, that pain was borne by the customer. $90 million in service reductions. And we've added some $45 million back, but we've actually constrained. So there's been a lot of pain there. The MTA has taken some $900 billion out of its cost. That'll go up to about $1.4 billion. In our last budget that we presented in December, we've added to that, and we'll continue to do that. And we're asking something, we call it the 3 net zeros, but we're taking it to a different place. Labor's share of that piece. I think we're at a place, we live in a very transparent, visible, political, small p environment, and we need to make sure that everybody is looking at this the same way. So I think the way I would answer the question is, whenever you're in a difficult collective bargaining situation, I think both parties, all parties, have to stand in a different place to try to find a way to solve the problem. So it's not labor, it's not management, it's all of us together working together.
I guess what I'm asking, though, is there have been difficult collective bargaining moments in the past, but it sounds like the implication of what you're saying is that the union's understanding of the money that's there for them is not realistic. That there's something permanently off about this notion that the MTA is going to be able to find what they want for raises and keep...
Ted, if you accept or buy into the concept of shared pain, yes. I'd say yes. They don't understand. Okay, and I can appreciate the position they're in. No one likes to be able to not get what they feel they deserve. So I understand that. But in my time at the MTA, and I've been here and away and back, we'd never had the financial problems we experienced in 2010, and we're not out of them because we spread some of that pain over a number of years, reaching forward. So yes.
On Monday, a Metro North conductor put 500 apology letters on the seats of riders. It was very unusual. A lot of riders were touched by it, and some people said they had never heard of that in 20 years. I was wondering what you thought of the gesture and how you thought about how he communicated with riders. He had told them to take an express train that had been canceled.
Well, I'm going to answer, but ultimately the decision is Joe Giletti's in terms of how to approach it. But first of all, in terms of the gesture, in terms of what he felt and the frustration in terms of how he impacted customers. I don't think anybody can argue with that. Right now, Metro North is going through a series of issues that are extremely difficult, and for an agency that provided exemplary service and now it's not, that's very painful for them. So the action that he took in terms of its intent, I don't think anybody can argue with. I think what's important, though, is that we need to be able to make sure that we project forward that empathy, because the customers are seeing it. But at the same time, employees can't take actions on their own, however well-intended they are, if they're taken in a vacuum or not without knowledge as to what's going on. His intent was well. He may have had a lot of prior experience where the action that was taken, had that been taken again, his directions and his instructions to the customers would have been spot on, but that wasn't the case here. And it's essential for our operating employees, when we're giving directions to customers regarding what they need to do, whether it's a service issue or an emergency, that they're fully plugged in and coordinated with everybody. So that's the best way for me to respond. His intent was well intent. We understood clearly.
Tom, you mentioned the disability offset in the railroad negotiations. The union has said that it's punitive, that it would punish current Long Island Railroad employees for the sins of past employees, that it would punish the legitimately disabled, theoretically, and that it assumes that everybody going forward who applies for occupational disability would be doing so fraudulently. What's your response to that?
I'm not so sure I agree with that position. We certainly have a problem. I mean, this is not a small problem. It's one that you've seen the cases, you've seen the convictions, you've seen the magnitude of the problem. There's a behavior out there that we need to address. I do not think we should penalize people that aren't going to abuse, but we need to do something, and there needs to be a dialogue, because I think everybody sees that as fraud and waste that we can't accept. Not today. Not as public servants, not as people. So that's the best way for me to respond to it, Alfonso.
Jim, last question.
This past Sunday, there was a demonstration at City Hall by family members who have lost loved ones in accidents in the streets of New York, and one person who spoke talked about a family member dying because they were run over by a New York City bus, an MTA bus. So has Mayor de Blasio's administration reached out to the MTA to participate in Vision Zero in any way?
To my knowledge, they have. I believe Polly Trottenberg has reached out to Carmen Bianco. We certainly, as somebody who is an operator of a lot of vehicles on the street, need to be aware of any and all of those initiatives, and we will. I think I don't think anybody can argue with the ultimate goal of Vision Zero. But yes, we've been in contact, and Carmen has got a relationship with Polly Trottenberg to that effect.
Did you talk about training drivers or anything specific?
Carmen?
We did not get into the details. What we were able to establish at that point is that we will work together, and that we're open to those discussions to look at it and look at our part.
Great. Thank you all.